Welcome to Your Brand Amplified, the podcast where we interview marketers, publicists, and brands to learn their stories, what makes them tick, and tips and tricks that make a difference. I am so excited to have a fellow podcaster on the show today, Travis Albritton of Honest Podcasts. I love that name. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So let's talk about your background. You were at Buzzsprout, which is what I use for my podcast. I'm sure many people listening, if they have a podcast, are also fans of that platform. So I'd love to talk about how you got into the world of podcasting. What did you do before? And this is a multi-part question, obviously. And then when you decided to go and launch your own business.
So my background before podcasting, because podcasting hasn't been around that long, was in aerospace engineering. So I went to school to be a rocket scientist. And that was the first part of my career pre-podcasting. But as with a lot of aspirational millennials that want to make a difference in the world, I got about 5-6 years into it and realized it wasn't really what I wanted to do with my life. And so I started exploring what else could I do? So I started all kinds of side hobbies and things that could potentially turn into something, maybe not. And fell in love with podcasting just as a medium. It's great. You can just pop open a microphone, start recording. You don't have to do your hair. You can be in PJs. Nobody even knows. It's great. And as someone who doesn't love to write, but has no problem talking as an extrovert, it seemed to be a really great opportunity to, hopefully make something meaningful and helpful for somebody. But in the process of doing that, I used Buzzsprout as a customer first. And then was just in a Facebook group by happenstance and ran into one of the co-founders.
Wow.
Turns out I live in the city where the company is.
Oh. Had
no idea, both in Jacksonville, Florida. And so, we started talking and invited me over to the headquarters, the building. And I was like, this is a really cool opportunity. That's like a YouTuber going to Google. How often does that happen? So what can I do to really thank them? And what could I bring that would be valuable as a thank you? And so I had been learning a lot about content marketing and been experimenting it with myself. And so I brought to the table, here are some ideas, some things that I think you guys could do that would really help establish Buzzsprout as kind of the go-to podcast host. And this was, 5 years ago at this point. And as we're talking, we're just kind of getting to know each other. Kevin, one of the co-founders, and Albin, the head of marketing, look at each other and they say, we've talked about all these different ideas, but we don't have anyone on the team who can do them. Would you be interested in working here? So within about 30 minutes of meeting, we start talking about what could a role look like, and I didn't go in with that expectation. I was just I'll take a shot. And I was looking for something different at the time. And it just kind of worked out that right place, right time, and just going for it turned into, a 4-year gig stint at Buzzsprout as the head of content.
Very cool. Wow.
So then while I was there, I was responsible for basically creating all of the content marketing for the company, the YouTube channel, all the podcast content. I did the blogs for a little bit and just working with independent creators, helping them be successful, answering questions, reviewing microphones, doing software tutorials, just the whole A to Z, everything you can imagine about producing, growing, monetizing a podcast, whether you're just doing it as a hobby or as a business, you want to make money, you don't, and really enjoyed that. But then in the process of doing that, discovered maybe it wasn't that I didn't like my last job. Maybe I just don't like jobs. Maybe I just don't like working for someone else.
Right.
And, Buzzsprout's a fantastic company and it's the best job I ever had. But at the end of the day, I still felt like it wasn't exactly what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
And it was at that time where another company had actually approached me to try and poach me from Buzzsprout. And I wasn't really interested. But I said, well, why don't I try this just as a consult on the side, make some extra cash, go on an extra vacation, see what happens. And that quickly turned into multiple clients. So I kind of stumbled into the business I'm in now.
Oh, nice.
Where I had never even really considered that people would see me as someone trustworthy to make their podcast for them. Mm-hmm. But then it seems like a no-brainer now looking back that would have been a viable next step for me.
Yeah, you've had all the research, you've done all the work to figure out what the best equipment is, like you said, the best strategies, the best platforms to use to do our interviews. Yeah, I'll definitely have to talk to you about that.
Yeah, for sure. We could take this in any number of directions because I know a lot of people listening to this show and other shows are thinking about, okay, content seems to be here to stay. Podcasting is here to stay. How do you get started? What's the best way to get started? Does it make sense to do it yourself in-house, to outsource it to an agency and all those kind of things? But I think one of the cool things thinking about my story, because I've been able to share it on other podcasts as well, is just you never know what the future holds. And so I think always being open to opportunity, always being open to pivoting where you think you're going or what you're hoping to do is so critical, not just for businesses, but individuals, because we're always changing. We're always shifting the things that are important to us. It's like 4 years ago, it's just me and my wife. Now I have 2 kids. So my priorities have shifted quite a bit just because life circumstances change. Yeah, I got my daddy shirt on.
Nice.
And so, we got Father's Day weekend coming up when we're recording this. So I think always just being open to possibility and seeing that maybe, for me, I recognized I wasn't exactly where I wanted to be. Mm-hmm. And even now I know I'm still going to grow into, something in the future, but just really being patient with the process and letting things play out and just taking your opportunities when they come up. Because the worst thing that can happen is to say no, right? Like I was doing, as any good podcast guest should do, I was doing a little internet snooping on you before we hopped on. And, I was seeing on your link, Annika's changed roles since we first started talking. Now she's working at this marketing agency where before she was not. Like, how cool is that? But just always being open to opportunities and open doors and not being afraid, whether it's, in business and trying new technologies or new softwares or new capabilities or just personally. I think that's what makes life exciting.
Oh, 100%. When I lived in Houston, I had a radio show that was also on Facebook Live. And then I moved back to Los Angeles and we kept it going a little bit remotely. But the cool thing about Houston was we had multiple sets. So we would film a segment and then we would have a little commercial break. Then we go into the next. And it was so fun. And we were able to do that on radio and Facebook seamlessly. But then, of course, pandemic. And I started having clients ask me to host podcasts for them. And then I quickly realized that they didn't really have the time, the money, all the resources. I'm like, I'm getting all the guests for your podcast. I'm spending all of the money that you're giving me on the production. So my boyfriend said, why don't you just do your own podcast? You know how to do this. You're an extrovert. You love talking to people. I was like, oh yeah. So to your point, I had no idea 3 years ago that I was going to start my own podcast, but also I should have thought that that could be a possibility since I had done a radio show and done other mediums before. So it's a great journey. And then, yes, I have changed roles. I don't even remember when we first started speaking, probably 6-8 months ago, something around there.
So. Yeah.
Yeah. And I had already been talking to this company. We had a very nice long vetting process to make sure that we were the right fit for each other. And the beauty is I still get to be entrepreneurial within it because I'm bringing things that weren't part of the previous capabilities and capacity of the company. So I'm getting to learn new things. The CEO is getting to do things that she's always wanted to do. So it's really fun. And that's what keeps it fun and interesting, right? Is that there is the opportunity to have growth.
Yeah. And, I think a lot of people have said this. It definitely didn't come from me. I won't try to claim credit for this, but it's very hard to stay in neutral. You're either moving forward or moving backwards. Just because everyone else is either moving forward or moving backwards. And so, never being afraid to try new things or to push in new directions. It's very easy to get comfortable, especially in business. It's like, okay, we got profit margins, we got strong revenue, things are going great. Like, what could go wrong? Surely a global pandemic won't shut down the economy or anything like that. And so, just always improving, always getting better, and just seeing business as an opportunity, just one opportunity to do that.
Yeah, definitely. Now, something you said earlier struck me because you said you can podcast. It doesn't matter. Don't have to have your hair done, whatever. You can be wearing your bathrobe. But I feel like video is becoming much more important, like it is with every medium in the podcasting world as well. So I'd love to hear how you've seen that change. If there really is a big change or it's just something we're being fed.
So there's a couple of things here. So I'll start off by saying there's no rules. The thing I love about podcasting is every rule is meant to be broken, right? So one of the most common questions that somebody who's starting a podcast will ask is, what's the ideal length of a podcast episode? It's like, well, it depends. It really depends. For Joe Rogan, it's 3 hours. For a daily podcast, it's probably 6 minutes, right? So there's no like golden rule, like thou shalt have 45-minute podcast interview. First of all, to say that surely, you're definitely right that video has started to creep into podcasting. Some of this is a Joe Rogan trend that he started. Some of it is YouTubers getting into long form content. And so you'll have people with really large established audiences of, 10 million plus YouTube subscribers jumping into podcasting. And since they know video production, they're bringing that to the table as well. And then you're just seeing more and more brands and networks like iHeart and Sirius and others investing in personality driven podcasts. Mm-hmm. Where the person isn't really the showrunner, they're just the personality. So it's like New Heights is a new podcast with Travis and Jason Kelce, 2 professional football players. And they just hop on Zoom and talk about football. And there's a whole team apparatus around them to support that production. And so what you're seeing with higher end podcasts that have more resources is they're all shifting to video. The reason being that you can put it on YouTube because podcasts historically are hard to discover. They're very difficult to grow because you have to spend time actively listening to something to decide if it's something you want to listen to in the future. There's no visual element. There's no, oh, I can watch a clip from a video and decide if I like it or not. So the hurdle is really high to get somebody to listen to your show. Having it on YouTube helps increase the reach and distribution of it. And then it also opens up the possibility for repurposing the content, right? So you can take short clips and put it on TikTok or YouTube or Instagram, which is really difficult to do with audio only. Right. So you don't have to have video to be a successful podcaster, but that is a trend that we're seeing. And I think if you have the luxury of being able to do video, then it's a great opportunity. So most of the clients that work with me end up doing video podcasts. We end up doing video clips and repurposing it for social to get more reach, but you don't have to. It's really up to you.
Yeah. Another question that people always ask me, they're like, oh, you're a podcaster. So do you make money on your podcast? Do you get sponsors? Do you have commercials? And I played a little bit with that stuff, but I said, it's actually not that easy if you're not, to your point, a big personality, somebody who's very well known and has a big apparatus behind them to get really good sponsorship deals. I know there are a lot of companies out there who will say, we're going to get you a $15,000 sponsorship before your podcast even launches. Well, maybe, but most of those companies don't really do that.
Yeah. Podcast monetization is just like YouTube monetization, is just like social media influencer monetization. There is a very small percentage that have most of the profit, get most of the sponsorships, and you have a long tail of a lot of people that make close to zero.
Yeah.
So the problem with the way that most people approach monetization with podcasts is they think about it as a commodity. Every podcast is distilled down to, well, how many downloads are you getting? And that's the value of your podcast. But the real strength of podcasting is that it's so hyper niche specific that you can get really, really targeted with your listenership, with your audience, right? There's literally podcasts about like being a hobby beekeeper.
Wow.
That would never be like a daytime radio show that you pick up on an FM station because it's not a broad enough appeal. But podcasting gives you an opportunity to go really deep on things that people are really interested in. And so rather than saying I get 1,000 downloads an episode so I can earn $25 for an ad slot, which is the average, you can approach companies that make products and services specifically for people that are beekeepers, if we're going to keep the example going here, and say, hey, I have a beekeeping podcast. Yeah. Let's set up a relationship where as I refer business to you, I get an affiliate commission. Or we do some kind of creative integration where I bring you on to interview you and put your company in the creative of the episode itself. I was talking with a client of mine who has a golf-related podcasts, and they have a lot of professional golfers on. And we talked about approaching companies and saying part of the value of sponsoring this podcast is we're going to have these PGA professional golfers read your ad. And we're going to give you the video. We're going to give you all this content that you can repurpose in your own social media. So you're not sponsoring a podcast. We're giving you user-generated content for a target audience that you can repurpose and use yourself.
Nice.
If you get at this level, then we're also going to plan this like weekend trip at this really nice golf course and you're going to be playing with this person. And so then it becomes like an experience that you're selling instead of how many downloads do you get on your podcast? The best way to monetize a podcast is not to monetize the podcast itself, but the opportunity to get the right people in front of the right advertisers or the right brands.
Right.
And then not pricing yourself based on the number of downloads that you get, but based on the upside of what the relationship could do for the other party.
I mean, what you're talking about is a lot about what you hear with going back to the social media influencer space, micro influencers who typically have much more engagement with their audiences than the macro influencers and have people who are really actually going to purchase a product or service because they have that trust built up with their audience. And it's something I preach about all the time as a brand marketing strategist and PR person. I'm always talking about knowing your customer and reaching the right people at the right time.
Yeah, it's so important. It's so important. And something else I'll say about monetization too is the most effective monetization strategy for a podcast is to build a business on the back of it. So to use the podcast as marketing to reach the kind of people that would benefit from your business. So for the branded podcast that I do for myself right now, Honest Marketing, the whole goal is to attract the kind of business owners that would be interested in me producing a podcast for them. So it's values driven, it's integrity driven, which are all the things that really resonate with me personally. And we're talking about marketing trends at a macro level, but then also specific strategy and implementation. And we're going to talk about podcasting because that's something that is in the zeitgeist now that people are talking about and thinking about. And it's something I have an expertise in. So then when I invite a guest on, half the time that guest is there as a prospect. I'm using the podcast as a vehicle to make a 1-hour connection with somebody who I believe I could serve with my business. And inviting someone onto a podcast to talk about what they're an expert in is a lot easier thing to get them to say yes to than, can I have 30 minutes of your time? I believe I have an exciting growth opportunity for your business. Are you interested in getting more qualified leads? Like the classic LinkedIn cold DM.
Oh my gosh, yes.
So you can have a podcast that's 6 months old that's generating 6 figures in revenue for your business if you're smart about how you strategically align it with your business.
Mm-hmm.
If the audience that you're attracting to that show, you're priming them up to warm them into a sales relationship with you, that's the most effective way to monetize a podcast.
Yeah. And to that point, again, brand awareness. I have been on many PR calls lately where publicists are saying they're now starting to use podcasts as part of their marketing strategy for their clients. And big brands are starting to not just have their executives go on podcasts, but start their own internal podcasts.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's such an incredible low barrier to entry on the equipment side, on the tech side, that it is a really easy thing to get going once you have all the pieces in place. Buzzsprout has a bunch of great resources. Some of them I helped create, some of them I didn't. But if you just go to their website or their YouTube channel, there's a ton of resources to help you get started. But I think one of the really cool things about podcasting, and I know this is something that I imagine that you would agree with, is that it's very rare on the internet to get more than 3 seconds of somebody's attention.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because everything's become TikTokified, right? Just swipe to the next video. With podcasting, once you discover a podcast you love and you listen to every episode, if it's a standard podcast, every single week you're listening for 30 to 60 minutes. Mm-hmm. Like where else are you going to get that kind of a depth of connection with somebody? You just can't find it online. It doesn't exist. And so if you're an executive or a CEO and you're either using it to grow your business, or if you wrote a book and you're trying to do a book tour, being able to come into an audience that trusts the host, that is there because they believe that the host is going to give them great content, and that person has handpicked you to be a guest on their show, that immediately creates a trust factor. And then when they're able to hear all the things that you could share for 30, 60 minutes, however long it is, that only continues to increase the connection they have with you, the brand. Like every study they do about podcast advertising, it blows most of the other mediums out of the water, whether it's video or programmatic digital or radio. Podcasting is the best brand lift, the best long tail marketing results for brands because you have that deeper connection that you can't get anywhere else. Yeah. So I think that's why a lot of people are looking to it, is in a world where everything is so ephemeral, all content seems to be just come and go so quickly, and you're just trying to hit the viral algorithm moment. Oh. Instead, people are starting to figure out, why don't we lean into a slower medium where we can have a deeper connection and actually get more tangible results, which ultimately, that's what we're all chasing, right? What's the ROI on the back end of it? Whether it's podcasting or YouTube or TikTok, I'm agnostic about the medium. It's really just about what's the thing that's going to get me the best results for what I'm looking to do. And a lot of people are discovering podcasts is the way to go.
Yeah. And something interesting that I found is that in the company I'm in now, it was focused primarily on digital marketing and branding and strategy for workforce development and education. And then when I came in, we also brought in entrepreneurship because that is the biggest part of workforce development, you could argue. But what I love is when our clients start listening to the podcast and start saying, oh, you talked to somebody about brand storytelling. And now I understand what you've been trying to tell me to do when I go into meetings to get funding from XYZ. I need to share those brand stories. I can't just come in with like all the data. I have to have the stories of the humans behind it that back it up. So I love those aha moments that are created that weren't even necessarily the intention of why I created this or why I started doing it. But that for me is a win. Like that's a beautiful moment right there. And the other thing, to your point about it being a great tool for advertising and marketing and all this connectivity, is the SEO value of podcasting. So I was able to get the .com for Your Brand Amplified solely because of this podcast, because the person who had it was in another country. It redirected to their website, and then they were not getting any play because Google page one was the podcast, whether it was me sharing it or guests sharing it. So it's very helpful for that and to help people really discover you, and that connection, that authentic connection that people are craving these days. They really want to know who you are, who's the person behind the brands that I'm going to be buying or the services. Because if you don't have the same values and they can't really tell, and then they find out, they're really going to be disappointed. And that's when people start talking out about brands, right? And not wanting to support them and trying to get other people to not support them.
Yeah, that's been a very interesting shift just to look at objectively, just how much the consumer behavior has shifted to values oriented instead of, what's the best product on its own or what's the cheapest commodity. People are just much more aware of the impacts that we have on the world and have on each other. And so I think people are starting to figure out like, oh, like my dollars actually mean something. Like I can actually make the kind of change that I want to make in the world by how I spend money. And some of it is not even that deep. It's just, I want to wear clothes that tell the rest of the world what I value, right? I'm wearing a shirt that says daddy on it because I have 2 young kids. So I think more and more people are starting to wake up to, especially direct to consumer brands and things that aren't like the large label, kind of like Walmart pillars, because they're much more intentional with their purchasing power. And so being able to be out in front, sharing your message consistently in a medium that people are looking to consume it in, not only does it help with people connecting with you, but it also helps just in the repetition of practicing it, practicing your message, practicing what you talk about and how you talk about and which stories resonate and which ones don't. It's just a great opportunity to consistently have that PR going out, telling people who you are and what you stand for. And that's going to bring people to you.
Yeah. Well, and to that point, one of your pillars is that your podcasts are marketing with integrity. I mean, honest podcasts, the name says it all. So have there been times when you've had to turn down a client because you didn't feel like they would be the right client for what you're trying to bring into the world?
So it's interesting. So this plays both ways. So I've had a couple times where I had a prospect approach me because of my reputation. And then, what they were looking for was not in alignment with what I offered. Either they misunderstood what podcasts are really good at, which it's not direct marketing in the way that you think about Facebook ads and Google ads. It's a much more long tail thing. But more so, I find myself turning down clients because they're not in a position where paying me to produce a podcast is really going to get them the results that they're looking for. Mm-hmm. And that's something that a couple of years ago, I never would have thought would be true, where I'd turn down people that wanted to work with me because I felt like it was the right thing to do. Not because I couldn't do a great job, but because I wanted to preempt them making a less than ideal investment for their business. Because I've certainly been on the other end of, businesses or agencies that promise the moon, show you a couple case studies, and then, okay, well, yeah, they didn't tell you about the 800 that flashed out and burned out on the same service. They just told you the success stories that showed you how awesome they were. And I think as people that have an expertise, if you're a business owner or people see you as an expert, they're going to take what you say at face value because they trust that you know what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. And so when I have people that have never made a podcast before say, hey, I want to invest in making a podcast, will you produce it for me? And I start asking questions. And it's like they're either pre-revenue or they're barely breaking even, or, they really need to spend more money on ads to drive revenue. It's like, listen, you could pay me to make this podcast for you, but I think that money is better spent elsewhere. Yeah. Like if I'm just being honest, like you could ignore me, you can go to somebody else and they'll make a podcast for you, but I just don't think it's the right fit for you. And so I think part of being honest or having integrity is not just choosing the right clients that align with you on a values level, but also sticking with your values when it negatively impacts the bottom line of your business.
Yeah.
Because it's not just about something that you say because you think, oh, these are the magic marketing copy words that'll get people to convert more, but it's really who you are. And so I think if we can shift away from just in general being a more transactional, relationship-oriented business towards a more personal one, that in the long run, word of mouth and friend recommendations is still the number one way that people discover new businesses. Just remembering that. It's like do business as if they were your neighbor and do your best to do right by them.
Yeah. I love that you're saying this because I think in the PR world, a lot of the same things come up. I've realized that people who have a million different things going on probably are not an ideal client because they're not going to have time to focus on PR, just like they would not have time to focus on building a podcast and being there for interviews, or if they're doing a solo podcast or whatever. And sometimes people will come in the process and I'll think that they understand that, like you said, it's a long tail game. We might get some quick wins, but more likely than not, it's going to take time to build. And they want that immediate, they want to be in Forbes right away or in Inc. or whatever. And that doesn't usually happen. Same thing with podcasts. It takes, would you say, at least 100 episodes to really find your stride? If you're not doing like a short term truncated podcast for a specific reason.
I think if you can make it to 100 episodes, you've outlasted 98% of other shows. Because platforms will put out like, here's the number of podcasts that we have, and it gets bigger every year. Spotify, I think, just said they have 4 million. But then if you look at the number of podcasts that have published an episode in the last week, it's like less than 250,000. Wow. So if you think about like the podcast graveyard is very large. Yeah. And that's because it is a lot of work. The secret to the game really for podcasting is just outlasting everyone else. Like the podcasts that are the largest are either celebrity driven, meaning they were like a Hollywood movie star before they started, or they've been doing it for 10 years. Mm-hmm. Those are the two camps. And so if you're thinking about starting, plan for it to take a year, 2 years, 3 years to really gain traction. But then it becomes like an unstoppable force where You've built the momentum, you've gained the audience over time, you've built the trust, and now you have this vehicle to point in whatever direction you want to. And so, yeah, definitely go in with eyes wide open. It's a lot of work, and it's a lot of work to grow a podcast, not just to make one, but it's definitely worth it. It's definitely worth it because if you're smart about who you're making the podcast for, it actually doesn't matter so much how many downloads you get. You know, like the example that I give, somebody asks, you know, what's a good number of downloads? It's like, well, if you are making a podcast for neurosurgeons, maybe 30 is like amazing. Because how many neurosurgeons are there in the world? Not that many. But if you're selling like a machine that neurosurgeons use in hospitals, you're going to sponsor that podcast for whatever they say the dollar amount is, because that audience is super valuable. Those 30 people are the right 30 people. So it almost doesn't matter how many downloads you're getting if you're not tying the monetization or justifying it by how large your audience is. If it's the right people and you can build a relationship and move them to take action on whatever it is that's meaningful to you or the reason why you started it, then as long as you're doing it, you're winning. And if you do it longer than your competitors, then you become the de facto leader in your space.
Yeah. If you don't have like a daily podcast, do you think there's a time when there's too much content or you can release too many episodes?
I think every audience is a little bit different. And I'll give a really tangible example. So I just had a client who has a podcast for entrepreneurs, and he had been doing a weekly show for a long time, wanted to increase his monthly downloads. So we talked about doing 2 episodes a week, and we shifted to that. And his downloads went down.
Ooh.
Like his overall downloads went down, even though we increased the frequency. Then we stopped it and we went back to 1 episode a week, and his downloads went back to where they were and then surpassed where they were. And they're now 30% higher than they were 3 months ago.
Wow. Yeah.
So not always, but sometimes it really depends on who you're trying to reach. So his audience are busy entrepreneurs. So they saw more podcast episodes popping up that they had time to listen to, and they weren't listening to them.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of this is trial and error. I think once a week is a great cadence. Twice a week, if you can make it work, is awesome. But again, there's no rules. You can do really great with a daily podcast. There are some podcasts like Hardcore History. He puts out an episode every 2.5 years, and he does great. So that's one of the beautiful things is there's no like right or wrong answer. I think just be willing to experiment and try things and let the data tell you what are people looking for. But in general, if you have an audience that's more busy, then less content is better, and just make that content as fantastic as you possibly can, because it really is a quality game with podcasts that once you cross the threshold of you talk about something interesting to me, what's going to keep me listening here versus another podcast that talks about a similar topic? It's usually a connection with the host or the quality of the episodes themselves. And so typically I encourage people, rather than doubling or tripling the frequency, spend that time, that extra time, making that podcast episode really great. And then whatever you have left over, spend it on other podcasts, bringing their audience over to you.
Nice. Yeah. So that brings me to organic versus advertising for your podcast. So I know that that is also something that people are always trying to think through. Obviously, you have to do marketing somehow or other, because like any brand, if you can't just put it out there and expect people to find you. But just the way that in social media, we've seen people come up with techniques to get around things and figure out how to build audiences that might be bots. Do we see the same thing in podcasting? Is it different? How do people ethically advertise in the world of podcasting?
Oh, I love that question. Ethically advertise. So one of the blessings about podcasting is that it is so difficult to grow. So once you have, if you're using a podcast hosting platform that's IAB certified, that means they've gone through an audit process, that the way they're counting your downloads is consistent with what the industry has determined, like this is a real person. This is a real person activity. And so like in Buzzsprout, if you see 1,000 downloads, that's 1,000 people. You can basically take that to the bank. And so when you're doing paid growth correctly, you're basically speeding up what would be happening organically. Like ideally, that's what's happening, is that people would naturally discover your show. You're just paying a little bit to get to the front of the line in front of the other stuff that they would see that day to connect with them and bring them over as a call to action, right? So when it comes to organic versus paid, the paid strategies I like to use are the ones that you're reaching people where they're already listening to podcasts and giving them an opportunity to listen to your podcast. So organic, that's being a guest on other shows. Sometimes if the podcast is large enough, they'll charge a fee for their guests, and you kind of have to do the ROI. Does it make sense to spend a couple $100 to get a placement to try and grow your show? Third-party podcast apps will let you advertise, like banner ads, Overcast, Podcast Addict, Pocket Casts, all the casts in the App Store have started doing this. And, you know, with some mixture of results, everyone's results are a little bit different. And then once you get to an enterprise level where you're spending $5,000 $1,000 or so a month or more to advertise your podcast, then there are agencies and services that work with the iHearts and the SiriusXMs and the Wonders of the world that do a more programmatic banner style advertising with Google, but you've targeted the audience in such a way that you're really reaching podcast listeners, and the call to action is driving them back to subscribe in a podcast listening app.
Okay.
But the stickiness of those audiences, of a paid audience, is always going to be less than organic.
Mm-hmm.
Just because people will take action on an ad and then 5 minutes later forget you exist. And that's just kind of like the nature of the game, right? Versus if somebody seeks you out because a friend recommended you, then the likelihood of them sticking around and listening to every episode is much higher. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like video or not video. There's not like a right or wrong answer. You just have to know what to expect with each and then decide, is it worth it? Right? So like if you have a really tangible ROI on your podcast where, you know, for every 100 listeners, you're getting one client and that client is worth 6 figures to your business.
Yeah.
Then you're happy to spend $10, $15 to get a podcast listener because you know in the long run, the numbers work out in your favor. But if not, if you're doing this just to share about something you're passionate about or as a side project, then it probably doesn't make sense to spend money to grow the podcast because that's not really what it's for. So it always comes back to what's your goal? Why are you doing it? And then does it make it sense to make this kind of investment for this reason? Or is that money better spent elsewhere?
It's almost like you're saying you really have to think about your brand and your branding and your strategy before you start the podcast.
Yeah, so much of podcasting is just being intentional.
Yeah, because sometimes I'll have a client come and say, oh, I want PR, but they don't know who they are. They don't know who their audience is. And if you're not ready for that, let's take you back here and let's walk through these exercises and make sure that it's really dialed in. And then we'll decide if you're ready to take that step. Yeah. So it's the same thing with a podcast. You really have to be intentional about what you want to put out there. I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of people who are just like, oh, I'm just going to start a podcast and don't have any strategy behind it, but they won't be as successful.
It really depends on what your goals are. If you just love to talk and you think it'd be fun, you don't have to have a plan. Just go for it. But then don't be sad if 3 people listen, right? So it's all about matching the expectations with the strategy.
So you mentioned that some of the podcast platforms are IAB certified.
Yeah.
And that's easy to find on their websites. And if they're reputable, they should have that information.
Yeah. At this point, almost all of the main podcast hosts have gone through that certification. So whether it's Buzzsprout, Libsyn, Podbean, Captivate, Transistor, Spreaker, all of them at this point are IAB certified. So they have trustworthy stats.
Nice. That's good to know. What about websites? This might be too into the weeds for people who don't have podcasts or are listening, but Chartable, Podkite, all of those kind of websites that say that they're aggregating, but then now with different rules, some of them are not connecting to like Apple or not connecting to this or that. So do you think that those are good places to look for stats also? Or do you think you should just go to your host and use that information?
So they all give you slightly different things. Like if you go in your Buzzsprout stats, since you have this post on Buzzsprout, it'll show you how many downloads attributed to Spotify versus Apple Podcasts versus other platforms. If you then go into your Spotify dashboard, your podcasters for Spotify dashboard, it'll give you different numbers because it's measuring them differently. It measures listens, it measures starts, it measures all kinds of stuff. And those don't match up one-to-one to an IAB certified podcast download.
Interesting.
Same thing with Apple Podcasts. So all of those, and Chartable is similar, where they're essentially putting themselves as a middleman between the podcast app and the podcast host and saying, hey, anytime somebody requests this audio file from this show, make sure we know about it first before you actually go and give them the audio file. And that's how they're counting how many downloads you get. But they'll typically inflate the stats a little bit compared to the podcast host because the podcast host is filtering out some of that data. For various reasons, mainly to not overcount bots or having one person download something 30 times on a single device and counting it as 30. So all of them give you slightly different stats. Typically what I tell people is just choose one because then you're comparing apples to apples.
Yeah.
Unless you're starting to talk about like brands and sponsors and giving them data, and they're probably going to want your podcast hosting stats, is really not about how many downloads your episodes are getting. It's what is the relative growth of my show over time compared to last month, 3 months, 6 months ago. That's where the stats are helpful for you. We're seeing like the big picture stuff, like the case before where we went to 2 episodes a week and the downloads dropped. It's like we could see that, so then we adjusted. So it really didn't matter if it dropped a little bit or a lot or an incredible amount. We could just see the trend happen and we were able to pivot and make an adjustment. So yeah, it's really not something to get too wrapped up in. I know a lot of companies kind of position themselves as like, we have the best stats or the most well-rounded or we integrate in all these things, but a lot of it's just marketing. So it's not as helpful as they might make it out to me. Yeah.
Well, and I love that you said that because I found myself in a situation last year where I had so many episodes recorded. I was like, what am I going to do with all of these? So I started doing 3 a week. And then in December, I was like, I'm just going to do one every weekday because it's the end of the year and it's my birthday month. And I definitely did not see an uptick, but I was like, I just have all this information. And now I've kind of reverse engineered where it takes longer to get on the podcast, but your episode will be released more quickly. So I don't have all of that to deal with. But I love the thought process and what you're teaching us about the ins and outs, the nuts and bolts of podcasting.
Yeah. And if you're not a podcaster, some of this will sound like, complete gibberish. But I think that the principle is, use a tool or a measurement or a measuring stick as it serves you. Sometimes it's not what's the best measuring stick. It's just, do I have a measuring stick that's helping me make the right decisions?
Yeah. Yeah. Very cool. Travis, what's next for you?
That's a great question. So I've really loved owning an agency. I never thought that I would, but I love that I get to work with all kinds of different business owners in all kinds of different industries and all different kind of things. So I just really love where I'm at. I'm not sure how long it'll last. I'm not sure how long this business will be viable. Maybe in 5 years, podcasts become obsolete and I have to go, another job. Who knows? But I think right now I'm just really enjoying the process of building my business and just working with entrepreneurs that want to invest in podcasting.
Yeah. And when you work with entrepreneurs, I know sometimes people want to do solo episodes versus interview style, or they have a panel, or do you work with all of those?
Yeah. So every single show is uniquely tailored to whatever the goals are for that podcast and for that host and for that business. So sometimes it makes sense for it to be a solo driven show because we're really trying to highlight the expertise of the host. Other times it makes sense for it to be an interview-based show, especially if it's B2B, because then you basically use the podcast as a vehicle to do B2B networking and sales. I've gotten several clients just for my own podcast from bringing on a guest and start the process and boom, now we're in business together. So it really depends. And I think that's one of the things to be mindful of if you start approaching agencies or outsourcing is ask them what kind of creative process they have for helping you develop the concept for the show. Because what you don't want is for it to just be a cookie cutter of every other business podcast.
Yeah.
If you're going to put the resources into making something, make it special, make it yours, and make sure that you can partner with somebody who can deliver on that for you.
Yeah, that's great advice. Thank you. Awesome. So the best way for people to find you?
You can just find Honest Marketing, the Honest Marketing Podcast, anywhere you're listening to this podcast. Yeah. And if you thought that I sounded half sane and want to learn more about how to grow your business with proven strategies without having to sell your soul as a business owner, then that's where I host those conversations.
Fantastic. And a little bit possibly unrelated, maybe not. Do you have a favorite quote or mantra, a family motto that you live by?
So as a high achiever, I tend to beat myself up quite a bit. I'm my own worst critic. And I remember reading somewhere, treat yourself like you are somebody you're responsible for helping.
Oh.
And I think as a high achiever, as someone who loves to go out and try and take over the world and do great things, it's easy to just completely destroy yourself when you make a mistake or something doesn't go the way you hoped it would. But I've tried to really live by that, by really cutting myself some slack, taking mental health days, just taking days off, because it's like, you know what? I just need a break. I just need to take the kids to the pool today. And remembering that life isn't just about achieving, but it's also just about living meaningfully. And so I would say that that's something that stuck with me.
That's a really beautiful way to end this episode. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Of course. And thank you to our audience. Podcasting is becoming so much more relevant than it already was. So much more important. More people are listening to podcasts than listening to audiobooks these days. So for those of you in any stage of your journey as entrepreneurs and small businesses, I think this is a really important episode to listen to and get Travis's advice on what do you want to do as your strategy for podcasting? Do you just want to be a guest? Do you want to start your own? What's going to work for your, where you are in your life cycle of your business? So I'm going to put Travis's podcast in the show notes so you can follow it, check it out. And if you liked our conversation, please give us both a rating and a review on Spotify, Apple, or your platform of choice. I'm Annika Jackson, and I'll be back again in a few days with another amazing expert. Want more? Check out amplifywithannika.com or follow me on socials at amplifywithannika.